moves down into the ground naturally. After all, we know that here on Earth, gravity pulls at somewhat constant 32.167 feet per second squared. In springtime, all that stuff is in the ground, which was grandpa and grandma, auntie and uncle at the molecular level. It gets sucked back into the trees. And the trees, they're connected by fungi. So the trees are talking to each other, sending these nutrients that were grandpa and grandma back and forth. And they help each other. The mother trees help smaller trees and other living things. So you see, the Duwamish have been in this ground for so long that all that stuff, the biological material that was them, is all around you. We're in the trees, the grass, the berries, everywhere. Biological extension, we are the deer that eats the grass. So coming back into your bodies, coming back to this call. I'm really excited to launch this series, like I said, but I'm really excited to introduce you all to someone who I've been personally longing to meet for quite some time now. And I just had the opportunity to spend 15 minutes with Dean before the call talking, and just like really humbled and excited to share the space with him. I took a prison abolition class last year at the University of Washington in 2019, and both of my professors kept talking about Dean in almost every single class, and we were going to have Dean come into our class. For some reason that didn't happen, but I did reach out to Dean for this series and he accepted. And so Dean, again, thank you. It's such an honor to have you here. Thanks for coming to take time of yours to teach us this evening. Yeah, so everybody, allow me to introduce you to Dean, which honestly, I think it's an extremely succinct introduction for all that Dean is and contributes to communities across the board. Dean Spade, has been working in movements to build gender, racial, and economic justice and prison and border abolition for the past 2 decades. That's a really long time. He's the author of Normal Life, Administrative Violence, Critical Trans Politics, and the Limits of Law. So we're gonna put that book into the chat so you can look it up. And also his latest book, which is coming out in October from Verso Press, which is called Mutual Aid, Building Solidarity During This Crisis and the Next. Again, we'll put that also in the chat so people can pre-order. Maybe we'll just do a silent round of applause since we can all see each other, but I will humbly pass the mic to you, Dean. Thank you again.
Thank you so much. Thanks to Shimona and Ale for the organizing, and Aaron. It's been really a pleasure already to work with you all. And it's just a really big deal for me to be with people in this group tonight. We are just experiencing the effects of climate change so intensely in our lives, so immediately. It's never been more urgent, but it will keep being more urgent for us all to be here and build really powerful, imaginative, bold movements together that connect all the dots of all the different parts of this work. And so that's why we're here. That's what we're doing. And I'm hoping to contribute something to you all. And just in terms of just giving you my 101 of what prison abolition and police abolition politics is about. For some of you, you've heard these ideas before. In that case, maybe my 101 is helpful of like how you'd have this conversation with another person, because I've just had it a lot with a lot of different kinds of people. So that's what I can offer. It's like that experience of having that conversation a lot. I'm going to share slides because I find that for some people, it can be helpful to see some of the words I'm saying this is one of my favorite pieces of art that you're going to get to see, and to get to, have the ideas underscored. And I can give these slides to the organizers so that you can look at them again later if you want to. Just this piece of art that I really love is by Seth Bachman. It captures, I think, a lot of what my political life has been about and what I believe. And I just think it's beautifully made. And we see us saving each other and ourselves all the time in these systems. Okay, I'm going to dive in. Ale is going to interrupt me if there's something that's not working, because I can't see the chat while I'm full screen sharing my slides with you. Okay. So the big question that maybe some of you are coming to is like, people often are like, are you into reform? Or are you into abolition? I'm just going to give you like the 101 of why those of us who are abolitionists are abolitionists. Like, what's the basic logic? So one thing is that the systems we have are actually the products of reform, right? So like a good example of this that Angela Davis, whose book, Are Prisons Obsolete, is kind of a cornerstone of this thinking, and I recommend it, it's very short and readable, says is, and she's also drawing from the work of Michel Foucault and others, the current prison system we have was actually a replacement of just drawing and quartering people and public hangings and that kind of state power, right? And it was this idea that we would put people in penitentiaries, and it was kind of a Quaker and Christian idea. And it was like, people will go into these solitary places and they'll be reformed by this kind of isolation, which of course is actually torture. So the whole history of prisons is a history of prison reform, and prisons have always expanded through reforms. Another example that Angela Davis cites and many others that's really meaningful to me as a feminist is that early prisons weren't gendered. It was just like whoever went in there. And mostly it was white men inside prisons because in the US, because enslaved people were disciplined in the context of their enslavement, and women were often disciplined at home, but to some degree, women might end up in prison. So then it was this huge reform to create women's prisons. And as soon as they existed, they put more and more women into them and built more and more women's prisons. So this kind of pattern of like reform often means it has always meant expansion. Similarly with police, people talk about how the origins of policing in the United States are slave patrols, in which white men voluntarily were forced to patrol the streets looking for slaves who are out without permission, and basically having a pattern of harassing Black people and engaging in violence against them that still lives on today and how a lot of whiteness is practiced. And then eventually that police force becomes professionalized, and that's a reform and becomes standardized, right? So all of the history of the growth of these systems is a history of reform. Another key piece of why we're abolitionists and why we have suspicion of reforms is that we fundamentally believe the nature of policing and imprisonment isn't one that can be changed through reform. Angela Davis's big argument here is that the contemporary prison system actually emerged out of slavery in the United States. So I'm sure many of you know that we have the largest prison imprisonment system in the world. We have 25% of the world's prisoners and only 5% of the world's people. And that our system is intensely targeted at Black people, Indigenous people, other people of color, women, queers, and people with disabilities, and poor people, and immigrants. So when formal emancipation happened in the United States, as I mentioned before that, the prisons weren't primarily filled with Black people because Black people were disciplined and punished by white people on plantations. When formal emancipation happened, there was a real panic among white people about how to discipline and capture Black people who were perceived as dangerous, unruly, and less than human. And also how to recapture the wealth that Black people's enslavement built for white people. And so something called a convict leasing system was invented, which meant that people could be, if Black people were arrested for anything, they would be put into this essentially slave-like conditions and then rented out by the state to plantations that were the same ones that had owned slaves previously. At the same time, something called the Black Codes were passed, which were laws that made it a crime to do things only if you were Black, such as being unemployed, being loud and unruly, being drunk in public, being irresponsible with your money, like adultery, like all of these things became punishable by imprisonment and being put into the convict leasing system that weren't punishable in the same way for white people. So Angela Davis notes, as many other scholars do, that kind of the 13th Amendment was written in this way to abolish slavery, but if you read it, it says, except as punishment for a crime. So basically, emancipation had built into it the replacement of the enslavement system with a expansive policing and prison system. And at the time of the convict leasing system, it was a huge source of revenue for the states like Alabama, Mississippi, et cetera, that had these large convict leasing systems. Today, imprisonment is not a source of revenue. That's actually a mistaken belief some people have. Prisoners do engage in labor for very low wages and very dangerous labor like firefighting, but the profit is not the driving reason we have such prisons. Prisons actually cost an enormous amount of money for states. So we can talk about that more in the Q&A, but that's a misunderstanding a lot of people have. Most prisons in the United States are not private. Most of them are public. Getting rid of private prisons would not get rid of our problem. Sexual violence is endemic to imprisonment. Every place where people are kept in those kinds of conditions, whether we're talking about foster care group homes or psychiatric wards or penal prisons or immigration detention centers, sexual violence is happening there. I think we all know that from our own experiences of living in the society. And that can't be rationalized out. We've had a Prison Rape Elimination Act on the books for many, many years in the United States. It's mostly used to punish queer and trans people for being openly queer and trans in prisons, and to punish people for consensual affection. We can talk more about that if you want to. It would be understood as a reform that actually made things worse. But it sounds good. Of course, we want to eliminate prison rape. It didn't do that. So the prison policing system, it is about protecting wealth. It is about finding people who look suspicious and getting them out of places. It is about capturing poor people and capturing people who are perpetually in those targeted communities. As I mentioned, reforms have expanded prisons and policing. I just want to name that a little bit from my lifetime, for the past 40-ish years, right? And I want to name, there's a really important prison abolitionist scholar named Ruth Wilson Gilmore, and she and her partner Craig Gilmore wrote a piece in a wonderful book called Policing the Planet, which I forgot to include my resources at the end. So maybe Shimon and Ali, you can help me put that in the chat. Policing the Planet is the name of the book. It's a great anthology with lots of short pieces that really help us understand why policing is the way it is today. But Gilmore and Gilmore say in their piece that when policing has gone through crises of legitimacy in the past, like the one we're seeing right now, and there was also one like this in the 60s and 70s when there was huge uprisings against white supremacy in the United States and settler colonialism and heteropatriarchy, and people were identifying the police as a problem. When it goes through those moments of crisis of legitimacy, it usually expands where it is and how much of it there is. So for example, after that crisis in the 60s and 70s, you saw now police are going to be in our schools as dare officers. Now police are going to be homeless outreach workers. Now police, you get more roles for police, and you get an expansion of budgets, and you get more police. So, and this is another example of this is the expansion of, police budgets have only expanded in my lifetime, and probably most of yours or all of yours. So it's a pretty amazing thing that right now there's actually a possibility of defunding the police as something city councils all over are talking about. And we need to be putting a lot of pressure on our Seattle City Council, who are trying to backpedal on their promises to defund the police. We can talk about that more. Another example of this is that this expansion is that, as I mentioned with the origin of women's prisons, the idea of creating special prisons to deal with problems inside prisons that to supposedly benefit prisoners is a classic mode of expansion. So that could be, oh, should we create a trans prison? People ask me that all the time. No, we should not create trans prisons. We should get trans people out of prisons, right? You can't create a safe prison. Because caging people is, an outrageous form of torture. Or in California, there was a huge amount of money put towards gender responsive prisons. Let's make prisons that are better for women, prisons where women can have their kids with them and have curtains that look more like apartments. It's a prison, right? Or let's add electronic home monitoring. That's a huge push right now in Washington and many other places, which just means we're going to imprison people in their homes, the same people who are targeted, and actually then we're going to expand it. Whenever they create a softer way, they expand it to more people. So we have to be suspicious of reforms that expand, which is what reforms do. And then finally, reforms have tended to legitimize and provide good PR for these systems. So this is, Dylan Rodriguez, another important abolitionist scholar and activist, talks about how this, in the 1960s and 70s, there was a lot of attention on how the LAPD was so racist and horrible. And so then they hired a lot of people from the very communities that they police, but they're still doing the same stuff, right? And so this move, and we saw this with the debate about our Black police chief here in Seattle, right? The idea of having LGBT police, women police, Black police. This is all part of a PR scheme that doesn't change the nature of policing at all. And another example of this is efforts to train police. Maybe if the police were trained in implicit bias, that's a classic one that lots of police departments have been trained in. Or maybe if they were trained in mindfulness, or maybe if they were trained in feminism, and it produces no less police violence, but it increases police budgets. This is an example I wanted to share. So the San Jose Police Department recently tweeted, look, we've done all these reforms. There's this website called 8 Can't Wait that suggests reforms that police departments should do, yet most of these reforms have already been done by the same police departments who are murdering people all the time. So this is the San Jose Police Department saying, look at us, we've done all these things, right? So this is for us an important argument about why this doesn't work and why this language is concerning and is used as PR for the police. Here's a counter meme made by a movement artist that says, hey, look, the Minneapolis Police Department was held up as a model of progressive police reform. They had all this stuff. They had body cams. They had officer diversity. They had implicit bias training. You know, they had mental health crisis intervention training, and they still killed George Floyd and so many other people. So this really helps us see the problem that abolitionists are trying to raise and concern with, right? I just wanted to put in a greenwashing one because the NYPD announced in July they are going to have hybrid cars. You guys all are thinking about greenwashing, I think, right? You're thinking about when governments and fossil fuel companies and other of our opponents decide to name themselves as pro-environment or clean. The police are not about that. One more example that makes me have to mildly vomit here in Seattle when I walk by every single business that has this sticker on its front, right? This is a campaign it was a PR campaign that Seattle police began not that long after they murdered John T. Williams, Indigenous woodcarver, and were under federal investigation. They created this campaign that said that they got all these businesses to put this rainbow sticker, stealing a symbol from our LGBT movement, on their businesses, saying that if something happens to me, I can run in there and they'll call the cops for me. Even though most queer and trans people understand the cops to be a primary predator, primary creator of violence in our lives. One more, just while we're at it. Sorry that I had to show you so many sickening images, right? So we see the police both with explicit propaganda like this, but also with other more insidious methods, using various kinds of reform to say that they are on our side, that they're part of our progressive movements, that they could be progressive, that they could be safe, when the evidence shows that this has no impact on their actual behavior. I mean, the NYPD is probably the most notorious perpetrator of anti-LGBT violence in the world besides the US military. Okay, so this is a time when we need a lot of discernment, and I think abolitionism is about discernment. As I mentioned, we're in a legitimacy crisis for the system of criminal punishment. And the question is, will this be a moment of recuperating that system and giving it a facelift, but having it be the same? Or will this be a moment where we actually dismantle it? We haven't had prior moments in my lifetime that dismantled it. So, and I'm not sure that we've had them in US history. I'm not sure if it's done anything but grow. So this is up to us. There's no guarantees. Just because a lot of people know who George Floyd and Breonna Taylor are doesn't mean this is going to turn out good. It's going to depend on how active we all are and what we do. This is an opportunity for mobilization, but it's also an opportunity for demobilization, because you can demobilize people by saying, but we have a Black police chief, but we have a rainbow police car, but we're going to get this training. This is demobilization. The system itself, including Jenny Durkin and all of our mayors and county councilors, et cetera, they want to do as little as possible to meet the challenge that's being brought by the protest movement that has been very, very disruptive. Thank God, because as we know, that's what it takes to see change. So a few key pieces about abolition. Abolition is about calling for ending all forms of caging people. So that includes ending the border. Like, we're opposing law enforcement. So that means not just the criminal punishment system, but also the immigration enforcement system, which of course are like totally tied together. It means getting rid of police. It means getting rid of disability incarceration. So a lot of people miss this one. And it's really important to think about, right? And we can tie together and understand these forms of caging people as very intimately connected and using kind of the same technologies, even if they pretend to be separate or different. And it also means abolishing the child welfare system, which is another system that takes Black and Indigenous people's children away from them and poor people's children away from them, but especially Black and Indigenous people's children, and incarcerates young people, especially primarily from those communities. So we're really talking about all of these, and I can give you resources. If some of those are less familiar, like especially the analysis around disability incarceration and child welfare system, I can also share more resources at the end. Most common questions asked by people who are learning about abolition. If you decide to identify as an abolitionist, you'll be talking about these questions for the rest of your life, and it's time well spent. What about the dangerous people? This is the most common question. We have all lived in a deep, deep propaganda police state our entire lives. We can see cop shows on TV 24 hours a day that tell us that the police save us from serial murders and serial rapists. This is the story that it tells, right? So just what are the answers to that? What are some of the answers to that? One, this has been a really centrally challenged by women of color feminists and immigrant feminists and queer and trans people, saying, you know what, the police and the idea that the police protect us is outrageous. They are the perpetrators of violence against us. I recommend Andrea Ritchie's book, Invisible No More. Maybe someone else put that in the chat, as a really great book about police violence against Black women, women of color, women with disabilities, trans women, et cetera. Really useful, very hard to read in terms of the content, but very well written and clear. In reality, sexual violence, the story that the police system tells us about sexual violence is that it's like stranger danger, happens in the street. And on TV, like 90% of sexual violence happens outside. In our lives, it happens between people who know each other. The people who are most likely to hurt us are our own romantic partners, fellow students at our school, our coach, our people in our family, our coworkers. Like that's actually where this stuff happens. And none of that is in the zone of the street policing that is kind of justified through this. And the ways to, and most sexual violence, and including child sexual abuse, is not reported, right? So the ways to solve it, criminal punishment, you can add sentence enhancements to that for the rest of your life. They've been doing that for my entire life, and it doesn't reduce the amount of it at all, right? And the prison and policing system itself is a site of sexual violence. So if we wanted to eliminate sexual violence or even reduce it, we would start by eliminating the prison and policing system. That would be one thing we would do. And then we would actually try to, and I'm going to get more deeply into how would we actually solve that. I'll come back to that. What are the proposals and practices being used? There's also a lot of, those TV shows are full of ideas about psychopaths and sociopaths. It's really important for us to question medical labels that justify the idea that some people are monsters. So first of all, there's been psychiatric labels, like there was a psychiatric label called drapetomania for people who wanted to escape slavery, right? Their psychiatric labels are placed by the medical industrial complex to tell us what's abnormal behavior, and usually to articulate some kind of anti-poor, anti-Black, sexist, or other agenda. So that's true about all psychiatric labels. So we should always question, if we're being told a psychiatric label and a psychiatric description is the reason a criminal punishment system should exist that primarily targets poor people, we got to question that. And then we might ask, even if there are people who are supposedly described by these labels, have they existed in every society? Why are they here now? Like most societies haven't imprisoned people because it's a terrible waste of every kind of resource, right? Why does this exist? Could we get to the root causes of this behavior if it exists? How common is it, right? Why are these labels so disproportionately used against certain kinds of people, right? So all of these, we have a kind of a critical question. If you're having that question, what about the sociopaths? Be like, well, where did I learn about that? Did I learn about sociopaths from Law and Order? What is that? That's propaganda. Like, how do I think differently about this? Fundamentally, who is in prison? Like who gets filtered through the system? People who are poor and desperate, right? What is the violence that's addressed by this system? People who get in a fight within their family, people who get in a fight on the street between neighbors. Like it's not like somebody who is a mastermind genius serial killer. There are a few people who are doing that. Mostly that's cops. I think a way we would reframe it, especially people on this call, is that if we wanted to get rid of the most dangerous people, if we wanted to ask who are the most dangerous people in our society, they are the militaries, they are the police, they are the oil and gas industry that are responsible for the air we're breathing right now. They are the elected officials who are complicit, who are bought off, who forward law and order and pro-fossil fuel policies. They are the bankers who've destroyed people's ability to have homes, right? Like we could really ask, where is the most harm coming from our society? And it's a totally different set of people than who's imprisoned. We know that the people, the Donald Trumps, the Larry Nassers, the Jeffrey Epsteins, these people are insulated from any kind of accountability. Our system is not designed to actually neutralize dangerous people. Second big common question, but isn't this impossible? First, I just want to ask you all to be like, what else are you all fighting for that other people think is impossible? Other people think it's impossible to imagine like real public transit or like free housing or like a fossil fuel free economy, a just transition. We all believe that's possible. So this is the same kind of question. It's like, it's absolutely possible, right? And so I ask you to use your imagination the same way I know you already are in other areas. We've lived in this time of neoliberalism where people like Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan have told us there's no alternative. This was their direct response to the very disruptive anti-colonial, anti-racist, and feminist movements that happened around the world in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. The 80s response was, no, it's only going to be capitalist extraction. We don't believe in that. So that message though lives in us, I think, emotionally. I think we've had to imbibe that to get by, to be taken seriously, to be seen as legitimate. So whenever that comes up in myself, I say, no, I refuse that conditioning. Every other human society on earth has been an alternative to this, because we are the most imprisoning country that has ever existed on earth. So that's good. Good news. And the system is really, really new, right? Like when we think about the fact that we imprison more people in our immigration system than anywhere else, that's only been happening since like 2002. I mean, really new stuff. And even the prison boom is only from the 80s, 90s, like, so this stuff is really new. It can be changed. All these policies went into place without people's consent, without people really knowing what they were. Most of this happens behind the scenes. The prison is somewhat invisibilized in the US in certain ways. This can be dismantled. We have to believe in that. We have to believe in change, or we might as well just give up on all the important things that we're all doing. We're not people who give up. And then the final question that's so important is, how do we create safety, right? We've been told this stuff keeps us safe. It totally doesn't. So shit, that we are all living in communities that are full of harassment, violence, and harm. There's three main proposals from abolitionists. One, we have to get to the root causes of what we now consider crime. Most of this stuff, this crime stuff, whatever that is, this behavior, theft, vandalism, or the stuff that ends up with people's kids in the child welfare system because their house wasn't clean enough, or because they had to leave the kid in the car while they went to a job interview. Most of this stuff is about poverty, stress, housing insecurity, lack of childcare, lack of healthcare. If we could just transfer the huge resources, in a lot of cities I've lived in a lot of cities I've studied, around 50% of the city budget, around 50% of the county budget is public safety. Think of all that money. What if it just went to housing? What if it just went to childcare? Like, if we could just transfer those resources from policing and prisons, not to mention the military, oh my God, to the people's well-being, so much less stress and friction in our lives, right? And I'm sure all of you know, I mean, I grew up in really intense poverty. When you are under that kind of stress, it is very hard to have peace in your family. It is very hard to, we're all at our worst when we're under extreme stress, and these systems put poor people under extreme stress and put people experiencing racism under extreme stress and people experiencing sexism, so there'd also be just different society in terms of level of conflict. If people were not under those stresses. The second key piece of the work, so the first piece is just redistribute. That will resolve so much what we call crime. The second piece is change the cultural norms that drive violence. So people talk about a rape culture. We live in a culture where everything about the sexist culture we live in says that rape is acceptable, that sexual harassment and stalking are romantic and cute, that certain kinds of people aren't allowed to say no. We live in a culture that's pro-gun and that we're a huge arms dealer. Like we live in cultures that romanticize the very kinds of violence we see, that have create a kind of masculinity that only can, where like men live in a culture where they're like touched less and where they're not allowed to show any vulnerability, and then they can only get touched through forced sexual touch on women. There's just so many cultural norms. What does this work look like? People doing healthy relationships classes with teens, people talking to each other about how to spot and identify violence inside people's families and inside each other's friendships and romantic relationships, so that we can actually intervene. There was a study that said something like 70% of people would intervene if they saw drunk driving was about to happen, but only 9% would intervene if they thought that child sexual abuse was happening. Like, we are just underskilled about how to show up for each other. Like, hey, my friend, they seem like they're isolating in this relationship. I feel like there's kind of a control dynamic. I saw this thing happen at a party and I just say nothing or do nothing. I'm scared. Instead of, oh, do I really just relentlessly reach out to them with love? What are we doing that lets each other fall out, right? So there's a lot of skills classes happening. There's a lot of, just deep, there's all of our movements are doing just deep, million kinds of training around consent, around all these pieces. And then the third piece is having actual facilitated processes when harm happens, right? That's what the world I'm part of calls that transformative justice. This is not processes that include police or prosecutors, processes in community. So what does transformative justice look like? Its goals are to ask these few questions. What does the person who did this harm do? What did the person who did this harm need in order to stop doing it, right? Does this person do this harm when they get wasted? Does this person do this harm because they're under this kind of stress? Do they have misunderstandings about gender and sexuality and consent? What does this person need to never do this harm again, right? what does the person or people who are hurt need to heal and participate in community again, to feel comfortable going to a party again, to feel comfortable walking down the street again? What do they need? How can we surround them with that support? What does healing look like for them? What conditions made this harm possible that the community surrounding it can change, right? So like, right now I'm thinking about Larry Nassar, like all the people who let him continue abusing those young people, like all the conspiracy around him, basically, that let people continue, but there's also smaller versions of that inside our communities. We all know that professor's creepy, but nobody ever surrounds the survivors and says, hey, let's like stop this, right? We know that if people had better transportation, or if these people had housing, they wouldn't have, like what are the conditions that produce the likelihood of this harm? A lot of people ask, what do you do if a harm doer doesn't want to participate in these processes? I just want to surface that question. So like if there's been a harm, I'm in a music subculture, I'm in an activist group, and I've sexually assaulted somebody else in the group, or I've been harassing people or whatever, and I'm just like, I don't want to be part of that process. In Transformative Justice, we talk about using leverage. So it's like, well, who could I hear from that I would say, no, I guess I need to. We talk about using all kinds of leverage, hey, if you don't participate in this, we're going to tell more people that you've done this so that they can stay safe by staying away from you. Or you need to do this, or you can't be in this leadership position anymore, or whatever. People, like, there's always community leverage. We are social beings. And so that's a lot of how people deal with it. And also if there's somebody who really, really, really won't change their behavior, which is not, always is not the norm. I think in many ways, because there is leverage when we use community approaches, when there's somebody who really won't change their behavior, you can also do stuff to keep people away from that situation with that person, right? That's like another thing, like don't keep them in a leadership position where they have access to a lot of people, right? Like whatever. So we can talk more about that. It's not as if there's no hard problems in this, but a lot of the situations people think about when they hear about transformative justice are kind of exceptional. So I just want to suggest that, like, most of us don't have skills for actually dealing with conflict. The system that we have now doesn't do any of those three things. It doesn't stop the person from doing the harm. They're just going to get out of prison, do it, or if they're not even going to be prosecuted because no one's going to report because people don't report for all these good reasons. It doesn't figure out how to heal the person. Sometimes it actually further traumatizes survivors, right? And it doesn't look at all at the underlying conditions that produced it. Transformative justice is different from restorative justice. There's a lot of different pieces in that. Some of the readings I'll give at the end. I can share more about that. I'm happy to talk about that if people want to hear about that. I realize I'm just going to try to get us through these final slides. So abolitionist strategies, there's kind of three main abolitionist pieces of work that maybe you've seen happening. One is just helping people survive. All the survival work, all the mutual aid work, supporting people who are in prisons, jails now, supporting their families, supporting people in criminalized communities just to survive. And that's its own form of organizing, doing the kinds of transformative justice processes I just talked about, and all the mutual aid we're doing to keep each other alive. Like all of that is abolitionist work. The second kind of work is dismantling work. So this is the work, the campaigns to shut down the detention center, campaigns to stop prison expansion in Washington, to not build a new youth jail, which they did build, but we're now going to close. Get the cops out of schools, get the cops out of the hospitals, get ICE out of school, get ICE out of, defund the police, all the work to decriminalize anything, decriminalize cannabis, decriminalize sex work, all of that work is all the dismantling work. And the third piece is just the kind of combination of two of them and more, which is building the world we want and need. In a world that was just, and which people had what they needed and weren't desperate, and where we had less violence, what would the transportation system look like? What would the energy system look like? What would the school system look like, et cetera? Abolitionist, one thing I want to just clarify. So abolitionism has a critique of reform, but it's not like there's no reforms. It's like we're assessing whether reforms get us towards our goal or not, or whether they're taking us in the wrong direction and building the system. So abolition provides the clarity of the goal to which we're moving. Of course, it includes incremental change. Shutting down one prison is incremental change. You didn't shut them all down at once. That's not a thing, right? Defunding the police in this budget cycle and next budget cycle, these are all incremental. But it's just knowing, it's assessing whether the reforms we're talking about are beneficial or not. And there's some really great kind of charts people use to discern this. I'm happy to share those too. We ask ourselves these basic questions. Is this going to legitimize or expand the system? If it is, we don't want it. Is this going to divide us into deserving and undeserving? So is this only going to be for people who have nonviolent charges? We know that there's racism and who gets charged with what. Is this only going to be for people who don't have an immigration issue also? Is this only going to, et cetera? As long as people who can afford attorneys or who can pay certain fines. Will this shrink the impact or footprint of the carceral system? Right. this is the idea here is this idea people, you might hear abolitionists say, of non-reformist reforms. Reformist reforms are the ones that have all the problems of reform. They build the system. They divide us into deserving and undeserving. So we're looking for non-reformist reforms that actually go towards our goal. Abolitionism is just clarifying that goal. Okay, I want to just give 2 pages of resources. This is a set of resources I think are really useful about the limits of reform. There's a new book out. I highly recommend it for a book group. Each chapter focuses on a different kind of system, like electronic home monitoring, child welfare, etc. Prison by any other name. Great book. I really recommend the recent Miriam Kaba New York Times op-ed. Yes, we literally mean abolish police. She just knocks it out, goes through this argument. I recommend the Mi Gente Free Our Futures policy platform. It's from a year or 2 ago that looks from an abolitionist perspective at immigration enforcement and what needs to change. Obviously the Black Lives Matter policy platform also working at these things. And I recommend the Decriminalize Seattle and King County Equity Now blueprint document that was put out this summer. That's their blueprint for exactly what can be done in this budget season in Seattle, and generally the picture of like what it means to move resources out of Seattle police. And then one other page of resources is resources about transformative justice. For a lot of people, these are new ideas. I really recommend reading up on it. A lot of people are like, I can't picture this. And so it's good to start by picturing like, oh, where do I already do this? Who do I already forgive? Where do I already do repair instead of abolishing the person, like, kicking the person out of my life? People will do it with children a lot. We actually repair instead of being like, you're out, you're going to be put in a cage, right? Sometimes we do it with our lover. Sometimes we do it, in other community spaces that we're in. So Generation 5's Ending Child Sexual Abuse, Transformative Justice Handbook. It's free online. It really goes into detail. It's important to look at child sexual abuse because, one, it's something that we all have such strong feelings about. We've all been affected by it directly or indirectly. It's so endemic. And so it's useful to use an example that has been, it's so easy to stir the public up and say we need more criminal justice to address this. So it's a really important one. It's been a justification for a lot of expansion, and it hasn't worked. Child sexual abuse has not been reduced by the drastic expansion of sex offender registries and all these things. The Creative Interventions Toolkit, it's a huge 600-page toolkit about how to do this stuff. There's also a storytelling project associated with it. You can listen to stories of people who did processes and what happened. I really recommend that. Transformharm.org just has everything about transformative justice on all collected in one website. There's an Accountable Communities video series that I worked on with the Barnard Center for Research on Women that includes people from local orgs out here like API Chaya and Northwest Network, and lots of people from around the country doing this work that really goes through a lot of cool things about the ideas of transformative justice in short videos. So it's easy to watch. Watch it while you're doing the dishes. And this new book, Beyond Survival, that is anthology full of stories about transformative justice. I want to recommend. Oh, look, it's right there. Yeah. That is it. Do you want me to, maybe I'll leave those up for us. Maybe I'll just share them with Ale, and everyone can get them over email. So I am ready to take questions in the chat. If that's easiest for you, it might be kind of efficient to put them in the chat if you can, or if you want to be heard, then Ale is going to be looking for raised hands. I'm going to go look for questions. I'm just starting at the bottom, so I also might have missed them. Can I speak to how gun violence and how that can be reduced in the police-free future? Yeah, I think that there's a few things. I mean, one thing that my dear friend and collaborator Tourmaline talks about is that the most dangerous guns in the United States are actually the most registered ones. They're the police guns, right? And military guns. So there's always this liberal idea that we should do gun reform and make it harder for people to get guns. But most of those reforms are about not being able to get guns if you have a criminal history or if you have a mental health history. And those things are, you might have those things in a documented way, more likely if you're a person of color or poor, not necessarily if you're actually, so in the US, most guns are owned by white men. So we need to definitely reframe how we think about this problem. I think it depends on what kind of gun violence you're talking about. Certainly, if people didn't have so many guns, then when they get in fights, they wouldn't shoot each other so much. So I'm for could we stop the gun industry from circulating so many guns? Can we look at the root causes? That's a question I have. I think the idea of trying to get guns for the right people and wrong people is always going to end up super racist because of who has documented criminal histories and who has documented mental health histories. So I think it's really complex in that way. And we have to really push back against some of the narratives that are happening right now around the country in reaction to the defund movement, where cities are saying, but we've got gang violence like the biggest, most dangerous gang is the police. And some other really dangerous gangs are like these right-wing vigilantes who are going out shooting people on the street. And some other dangerous gangs are like fraternities. Like white men's gangs are like the worst gangs that have actually the most, they get the most like free reign to do it all. And a lot of what people call gangs in low-income communities, communities of color, there's a lot of complexity there. People are getting a lot of kinds of social connection and survival from some of those organizations. And so we might ask, what are the root causes of people needing to seek connection and survival, and through some of those methods, you know, through criminalized work, et cetera. So I think there's a lot of pieces to this gun story in the US. And I think I'd probably use the same things to address it. Like, what are the root causes around gun manufacturing? And then like, what's the stuff going on around poverty and policing? Those are probably like the ways I would come at that. All right. You mentioned the reformative justice is not transformative justice. Yeah. So restorative justice is a term that means a lot of different things. There's a lot of great things that happen under the restorative justice framework, but a lot of it also has been really heavily co-opted by police and prosecutors. And so they'll say they're doing restorative justice circles, but it's like there are police in the circles, and it's all being held over, like the possibility of being prosecuted for crime is being held over the participants. And so that's like not like going to be like a very healing space. And also, it's been done in a way, like there's a really great article that I can send to you all about how like the state of Minnesota like incorporated restorative justice, but it didn't change anything about the criminal punishment system there. The same people are arrested, and then some of you get put through this other process, but then the other thing is hanging over you. Same with like drug courts, prostitution courts, a lot of these alternatives that are in the system, they actually justify and legitimize the system and sometimes grow it. Like King County has hired new restorative justice prosecutors. So because of that, women of color, feminist, activists named this other thing transformative justice. It says, one, we're not trying to restore things to the way they were before the harm happened, because the way that they were is part of what created the harm. And two, transformative justice means explicitly we're not using the police or prisons or prosecutors at all. So saying that there are cool things happening under the rubric of restorative justice, I would just look at who's involved. If it involves the police and prosecutors, I would just be suspicious about it. Yeah. Okay. I'm just trying to read this. So it's also tiny. What does this mean for the military? In the very rare case that there is a violent shooter or genuinely violent needs intervention, would a National Guard group be brought in? Would it be civilians self-situation? Yeah. So I think that those of us who are abolitionists don't find that those kinds of armed presences, the military, the police they've been so disproportionately harmful to our communities and so rarely helpful. But the story is that like people have a lot of faith in the U.S. military, and there's like all this propaganda for it. But of course, the U.S. military is like the world's largest polluter and the world's largest source of violence. And so what we're talking about is not using those as solutions to anything, and then coming up with what really are those solutions. So like, what are the root causes of mass shootings? Why have they increased so much in a short period of time? Why are certain kinds of people always doing it? What would stop it? I mean, that is, like, what are the root causes? And then also, how do we respond when that's happening? Like, I think we saw a video of people working to respond to it on the street recently in Wisconsin, right? Like people trying to like stop that guy with the gun, and 2 people got killed, and that's horrifying. And the police were like encouraging it and letting it happen, right? That tells us a lot. Like, okay, so what do we need? So I've been part of groups where we've done like large scale de-escalation trainings when we are anticipating those kinds of possibilities. And I think there are ways. And so there's a lot of great training out there, a lot of great thinking about this. We obviously need to scale this up a lot. Most of us, we've been living in a police state where we're just like, someone else will take care of it. Something seems wrong, call these other people. And I think we have a desire a lot of times to keep in that system. And I think it's a little bit parentified for most of us. We want there to be some other outside, like mommy, daddy, who comes when things are hard. Transformative justice says, nope, we're going to actually work it out as locally as possible to the harm, because that's where the wisdom is, right? And so that, like, what does that look like in schools? I mean, what would it be like to have schools where we didn't teach toxic masculinity? And how would that change the possibility of the kinds of shootings in schools? These are some of the questions that we have. So I hope this isn't unsatisfying, but it's like, I'm trying to say 2 things. 1, root causes, and 2, responsiveness from the communities affected, and them getting to do pragmatic thinking, what's going to work here. And the same thing we're doing with disaster relief. Like FEMA sucks, right? FEMA could maybe show up really late, give you a loan to rebuild your house. That's like what they do, right? Whereas mutual aid networks on the ground in disasters are like, oh, we know where the old people are living really up high in this building that now has no elevator. We're going to bring them water. We know who has extra food, who has batteries, right? Like that's what mutual aid networks can do, that local wisdom. Same thing with responding to violence, right? The more local we are to the violence, the more we are likely to have that capacities. And it's also kind of like an anti-authoritarian, anti-colonial take. Like we don't want this idea that outsider coming in with a standardized response. We actually want self-determination for people about their safety. I realize a lot of this feels aspirational because we live in the society we live in now. So it requires some imagination, and then also some realization that mass shooting is not the typical experience. Typically we're dealing with stuff like domestic violence on our block or in our family, child sexual abuse, property theft. Like that's the kind of stuff that's actually happening in our communities most often, and we can practice in those things and learn. Okay. Can abolition come before elimination of poverty? In other words, do we have to address the causes of crime before abolition? And perhaps more broadly, how does our police prison system function with American capitalism, great class system? The way I look at it is I don't think we have to wait for abolition for anything, because if I just looked at all the violence and I wanted to reduce violence, I would take out the police, ICE, and prisons, because they are kidnappers, rapists, murderers. So that wouldn't mean that suddenly we had perfection, because we have a lot of societal problems that are really deep, you know, and those people don't help any of them, right? So yeah, like I think the abolitionist idea of like transferring resources away from policing and prisons and towards the needs of communities goes along with all of our other, you know, so many other leftist ideas about moving resources out of bailouts to oil and gas and into the hands of people unemployed during COVID, you know, like whatever. We have a lot of these ideas. They are simultaneous. They're, you know, the fight to tax Amazon, or the fight to, you know, get unemployment benefits for people who are out of work, or to make sure that undocumented people aren't left out of COVID relief is coterminous with and complementary to the fight to divest from fossil fuels and the fight to defund the Seattle police. That's how I see it. I mean, the relationship between American capitalism and prisons, I mean, I think I really look to the idea of racial capitalism as the way I understand what capitalism is. Capitalism and racism and colonialism were all invented and co-constituted themselves and each other, right, throughout the last 500 years or whatever it is. And policing and imprisonment is a key technology of those things. So, and it's not surprising who's impacted by it, who serves the cost of that. Okay, there's so many good questions. I'm sorry if I don't get to yours. Since the USA is a country that has the most militarized police force, is there any country or society that at the forefront of this police form of abolition? So yeah, I do not look to other countries in that sense. Obviously, like lots of countries have like a less armed police force or a less militarized police force, but the danger is that even if the police only had batons, they would use them on the same people for the same reasons. So that's why disarm is insufficient. And that's also why, like, I'm sure you all know this, but like, right, like when one of the big pushes will be like, let's have police have less lethal weapon, like they'll shoot beanbags at us and fire sound cannons and tase us. All of that has drastically expanded those industries, and they do all of that. They do that and kill people, and they do that and take people's eyes out, and they do that and you know, permanently harm people, and they do that to the same people. So we really want to move away from the idea that we could ever have in the US a police force that wasn't like a site of racist, sexist violence. That's what it will be used for. So I think that's one of the questions where we can have a really good debate, like, would disarming be a step on the road to abolition or not? I think it just, there's a lot that depends on that. We think that's the thing about this abolitionist discernment, is there's actually a lot of room for debate in it. Like we're doing this all the time with our defund campaign. Like, okay, will this get us there, or will this bite us in the ass? This is the nature of, you know, trying to figure out in any kind of social movement, like which reforms might have a backfire that you didn't anticipate, that your opposition can use to justify their ongoing harm. Yeah, can I speak more to the statement that prisons are not profit or capitalist machines? Yeah, so like during the Obama administration, there was some focus on private prisons, which of course are terrible. Maybe some of you are part of the shutdown campaign around the GEO-owned detention center in Tacoma. Private prisons are a big problem, but the problem with that was that Obama then signed an executive order saying that they were going to move away from them, federal level. I think Trump immediately undid, but that wouldn't even scratch the surface of the problems of policing in prison. And so there was kind of a problem or misunderstanding, especially among liberals, that what prisons exist to do is like make money off people who will like work inside them. And it's just a misunderstanding of the economics of prisons. Prisons are mostly public. They're incredibly expensive. There's a lot of complex economic transactions between prisons. Like, for example, Seattle pays King County Jail to hold people in it. And, you know, they pay other county, you know, like there's so much complexity in the, I would warn us to have a simplistic understanding. And sometimes this thing happens, especially for white people, where we're like, this is just a money issue. This is just a profit issue. And so we want to not see the white supremacy that's actually like white supremacy is incredibly expensive and it's totally worth it to capitalism. You know what I mean? So like, how do we just kind of like let that account be as complex as it really is? If you want to understand this, I recommend Ruth Wilson Gilmore's book, Golden Gulag. She talks about how prisons expanded in California. She shows how it was related to changes in agricultural lands, finance capital, deindustrialization and having surplus workers. I mean, she really gives a more complex account using like a Marxist economic theory, and it helps us keep that complexity on the surface. It's definitely not just for profit, you know, although there are people making money out of prisons, like the phone companies that charge $15 a minute, or or Geo, or there's lots of money changing hands, but it's not just like the reason prisons got bigger was because it made somebody money, because it really just cost a lot more money. It's state capacity moved from having any kind of social safety net to increasing prison and borders, right? So the other thing in here is like the left and the right, all the politicians, they all usually say they want a small government. They've built a much bigger government than we had before neoliberal policies. They just changed where it was. And now it's all in policing, prisons, borders, military, right? Can I talk about the medical industrial complex, mental health industrial complex in the context of abolition? So a big thing here is that a lot of us worry that one way that people get a misunderstanding in the abolition conversation is they say, oh, people have mental health issues and that's why they're, disturbing the peace or hurting each other. And so they just need to instead be locked up in psychiatric facilities. And we just really want to watch out for that, because psychiatric labeling and who's incarcerated in psychiatric facilities has always been race, class, gendered, et cetera. And we don't want to like justify that system that has policed norms and also has given people like endless incarceration. Some of you know here near Seattle, we have McNeil Island, where people are in civil confinement, which is endless till doctors there say they're allowed to leave. It's a very common thing. So just seeing how, also we don't want like to replace the police with a bunch of social workers. Social workers actually do a lot of racist policing to poor people already, right? That's what the child welfare system looks like a lot, is like, especially like, white social workers or our middle class social workers telling poor Black and Indigenous mothers that their mothering isn't good enough, and putting them under the microscope. So we really want to be careful with how social work, medicine, these are part of the same white supremacist and anti-poor, sexist, transphobic, et cetera, rationales. So we don't want to replace, we want to actually move towards self-determination for people and collective self-determination and real safety, not like a new mommy daddy state that's just in the form of a social worker instead of a cop, and that's just a real danger right now that I think we're trying to lift up. I'm part of a group that's putting out in the next, on Monday, we're putting out a big statement about reforms to oppose from this perspective, concerns about disability justice and abolition. And so look out for that. And it might be of use to folks who are wanting to make sure they catch that nuance. 7:01, and I didn't get to answer all your questions, but I do believe in ending things on time, just as respect for everybody's, like what everybody put aside. I will give these resources and the slides to the organizers so they can share them all with you. And I'm really grateful to you all for being here. Oh, someone asked if I offer courses to undergrad students. Anyone, if you ever want to come to any of my classes, you're welcome to come there, especially when they're on Zoom. It's easy. So you can email me, and SU undergrads can opt to take my classes.